Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this NCRLL webinar dialogue on AI and composing just education futures. This conversation was recorded in two parts to accommodate everyone's schedules, and it's been edited together into one webinar for coherence. I am Dr. Grace Enriquez with my colleague, Dr. Victoria Gill, both from the Language and Literacy Department at the Graduate School of Education at Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Joining us today to discuss the topic are fellow literacy scholars and researchers, Dr. Stephanie Jones, Dr. Gerald Campano, Dr. Deetra Price-Dennis, Dr. Kevin Leander, Dr. Lucinda McKnight, and Dr. Tracy Flores. If we may, we'd love to address each other as colleagues and use our first names moving forward in the discussion. Stephanie is a Josiah Meigs Distinguished Professor at the University of Georgia. Her transdisciplinary research is grounded in feminist, Marxist, and critical post-human theories, and is concerned with education and pedagogies that produce a present that is healing and empowering while making a more just and ethical future possible. Gerald is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Gerald's scholarly interests span elementary literacy teaching, critical ethnic studies, immigrant education, and practitioner and participatory research approaches. Deetra is a professor at the Ohio State University. Her scholarship draws on ethnographic and sociocultural lenses to examine the intersections of critical literacy, education, technology, and equity-based curriculum development in K-8 classrooms. Kevin is a professor at Vanderbilt University. His research and writing addresses literacy in social space, digital environments and literacy, embodiment, and affect theories. Lucinda is a senior lecturer in pedagogy and curriculum and ArcDecra Fellow at the Melbourne Burwood campus of Deakin University in Australia. She draws on post-structural, feminist, and new materialist theory in her research into educational discourse, metaphor, and practice. Tracy is an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Her research focuses on Latina mothers and daughters, language and literacy practices, the teaching of young writers in culturally and linguistically diverse classrooms, and family and community literacies.
The first question is, what do you think is the root of the uproar and urgency around AI? Or in other words, why is everyone freaking out?
I think that these writing tools and things have been around for some time now, for some years, but the marriage of the chatbot interface to the back end of GPT really took people by surprise, because suddenly they were interacting with something that was speaking to them like a human, like another person. And I think that is really what has blown people's minds in a lot of ways and entranced them and intrigued them and taken the world by storm.
I freaked out about the freaking out question a little bit. I just had a couple of thoughts. They sound a little contradictory, but I thought I'd put them out there. One is that I think on the one hand, the freaking out is predictable from a media standpoint with respect to a long tradition of how we talk about technology and how technologies replace people or take over society, or in the case of schooling, how technologies do everything that we're supposed to be doing in school, or that kids are supposed to learn, and then all of a sudden the entire society becomes ignorant. And these are sort of longstanding discourses around technology that become associated with different texts as they come along. They're sort of like shock and awe narratives about technology. And I think there's also an interest at play from tech developers to have us feel amazed and to be at something like a New World's Fair where everything is new and the wow factor is really huge. So I think that's going on. The thing that I think sounds a little contradictory is that I think something really significant is happening. And I was thinking, and this is like a really dating myself kind of comment, but when I was a doc student, the graphical web was just being developed. And so, that was, people were talking about digital literacies for the first time, really. I mean, we were doing digital work, but the graphical web was developed, what, in 93, 94. And so, so this for me is, the second, it feels like the second big thing with technology and with literacy, the development of the graphical web and now these development of AI. So I think it is huge. So that'd be my two-sided thought about this.
Kevin, I'd also add, I think people, along with everything you just said, there's a certain component of fear. And so with that fear, misinformation can seep in and, help people run with the worst case scenario sometimes, particularly when they aren't aware of the ways that we have already been interacting and engaging with AI, more traditional AI. But if you're using Spotify, if you're using Netflix, like all those things are already a part of our lives. But I 100% agree with you that generative AI it feels like a game changer. And I think mixing all of these terms up, there's so much to try to hang on to. That it's hard for people that are in the field to make sense of it. So I can only imagine how, when I talk to my sister and my family in West Virginia, this feels very foreign to them because this isn't part of their world. And so I just think it's easy to grasp onto this is going to take away jobs, or students aren't going to learn anything anymore, or everybody's going to cheat, and your doctor's not going to really know how to operate on you, like all of the things that we hear from it. So I appreciate you acknowledging the contradictions, because I want to be excited, but I also want to be critical, right? And so holding on to both of those pieces is what makes me fearful of the fear.
Well, I love the way you phrased like this idea of freaking out, and Dietra and Kevin, the way you kind of talked about how on some level we're conditioned to freak out, right? Where freaking out becomes almost normalized in a way. Like you would think freaking out is kind of like an exception to life as usual. But now we're living in times where like we're all freaking out all the time, and it's scarily kind of become normalized. And I think at least, some of the conditioning, I think, has come through, I think building off, Kevin, what you said, popular culture. Some of my ideas about AI have really come, I have to confess, from a dialogue with my close friend who's a film theorist. And we were talking about like going back to like Blade Runner and cyberpunk, right? Where you have, this kind of melding of like tyrannical capitalism and, these very nefarious transnational corporations coming together with like technology run amok to create these dystopias, and really this kind of like global apartheid, this world of have and have nots, and I'm kind of freaking out because we're kind of in that world, in many ways. And I think it's real. Like I do think, and I do wonder about kind of Dietra, what you were saying with how AI is going to generally impact people, because it very much is emerging and arising within a context of global capitalism, a new permutation of global financial capitalism. I guess I just add to that, like, it just makes me think about this, concept of cyberpunks and that, kind of like a cyberpunk critical pedagogy or something that we might need to like develop in the field.
I'm thinking about what Kevin said, that he was around long enough to remember the first big technological advance, really, of at least our generation, probably. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember that when spell check and and grammar check came along, teachers were freaking out. Like, how do we know if they know how to spell? How do we know if they know, how to use grammar? And I think that a lot of literacy scholars have been saying for a really long time now that autonomous view of literacy is not really helpful. And I think the freak out, especially maybe among teachers, K-12 teachers and university professors that I hear, is so focused on that just a very singular idea about well, how do we know if they know how to write? How do we know if they know how to spell? How do we know if they know how to compose? And I think a lot of, I'm not freaking out about that necessarily. One of the first things I did in one of my undergrad, a junior level class, was tell everyone to open up ChatGPT and let's see what it can do. Let's do this together. Let's put in these different levels of complex prompts and see what it spits back out. And let's see how we can manipulate that by being in dialogue with the chat box. So I think the freaking out still stems in this very conventional idea of what it means to learn and what it means to write and what it means to read and why. So in a way, this is a double, I'm going to talk on through both sides of the coin. Also, I think we're out of time in literacy. So we're out of time. We can't stay in these very old conventional ways of thinking about literacy. And now I think maybe finally AI will really force the majority of us to realize that those don't hold anymore, these autonomous ideas or ideologies around literacy. And I am freaking out. I'm freaking out not because of all those things, but because this is motivated through capitalism. And talk about a literacy that many of us, maybe most, don't have access to. We still are not teaching people to understand how capitalism operates, and what it does, and how what it does to humans and everything beyond humans, and our earth and our subjectivities, our spirits. So I'm freaking out because this is motivated and it's accelerating through capitalism. And that's reason enough to freak out, because it's already, insiders are already saying it's already out of control, and it's the arms race. So here we are looking at this invention that insiders have compared to the atomic bomb, for example. And that's pretty terrifying. But that level of freak out, I think, is not on the radar of most teachers that I'm talking to. They're freaking out about the other kinds of things that might be happening in classrooms.
Thank you for bringing us here today. I appreciate this conversation. One thing that I've been thinking about as we've been getting ready for this conversation, and just what I've seen around on the news and at different institutions and different spaces I'm part of, is that it feels like things are moving very quickly, and we're trying to learn as much as we can about it, to think about how we're preparing our teachers, how we are engaging in our K-12 classrooms around writing. But also it makes me wonder about surveillancing as well. And I think that might be part of the fear in people feeling like everything is becoming more computerized, even though, like Lucinda said, like it's been here, and it feels like it's moving very quickly. And I have been invited to different conversations, and we're learning as we're going. And I think that we need to remember that this is also created by humans. And so we should think about that as we continue these conversations. But I think a lot about surveillancing and having just a hyper surveillance through these technologies. And I think that is causing also some fear and some concern about the unknown.
I think that, yes, the question of surveillance links to the whole ethical aspect of it. But I think it was also interesting how ChatGPT came out last November. And for us in Australia, we have a holiday over the summer. So teachers came back after the summer holiday, that December, January holiday, to teach in February, not having had any time to prepare and to think through implications. And so they were teaching full time, and at the same time trying to take on board this enormous societal change, really, that people are saying is on a par with the printing press, the arrival of the internet, maybe even as people say, a kind of Oppenheimer moment or whatever it's going to be. And there they are with all of their students in front of them every day, all of their lessons to plan, all of their marking to do. And it was just a very difficult beginning of the year for us. It's probably different for people in different places with different, academic years and timetables. But yeah, it was hard. And I think people were placed in an invidious kind of position where they were, as you say, Tracy, worried about surveillance and all these other kinds of potential ethical problems and risks, but they didn't have time to really think through what they might be. And they had all these pressures put on them too already to get students using these things, maybe because that's the future. And we had ChatGPT banned in schools in a large part of Australia from the start of the year. So you had private schools forging ahead, government schools having it banned. This question of, whoa, it's bad enough to ban it, but at the same time, hey, look, the private schools have got it in every class. So there were all these equity issues about who's getting access to what and who's learning how to use what. And it was just a huge sort of turmoil, really, that we're still living through.
I think she makes a point that was kind of like maybe on our minds, but I think she did it so well in her piece, which is something around how maybe there's a particular freak out in English education, right, or literacy education, and that particular freak out is that AI is good at doing a lot of things that are done in classrooms, as particularly as classrooms have become, through standardized assessments, we've had this sort of like what we know about writing pedagogies or literacy pedagogies has been like at odds with what's been happening through politics and through assessment practices. And so Lucinda says something like replication and like being trained through models is exactly what AI is good at. And so this freak out around what writing is, what we've made writing to be, through a sort of political and assessment driven and outcomes based perspective on literacy, has now met its match in a technology that can do it actually. But creating mundane 5-paragraph essays that say very banal things is actually really easy. It takes seconds to do, which is kind of hilarious in a way. And I mean, I know this is only one question, but there's obviously an opportunity space there for us also, right? In addition to the freak out, there's an opportunity space.
I appreciate what Lucinda said about access. That is something that I think about very deeply as we're having these conversations and thinking about the communities where I taught, the communities where my students are doing their internships for their student teaching as they prepare to be teachers in the next year. And I think about, like she mentioned, the private schools forging ahead, and then the state schools kind of banning it, or they haven't moved forward on that. And it brings up those issues of access and equity. And I think that we need to have these conversations in our classrooms with our students, our undergraduate students who are preparing to be teachers, and our graduate students who will be preparing teachers and we're all living through this together, and we can't ignore it. We need to definitely have these conversations with what we know and what we don't know, and learn together. And I think about writing, and I think about like spell checking and Grammarly and all these different tools that are out there that we use, and those are helpful, and it doesn't take away from what we're doing as writers. And I think that we need to talk about how these can be used in our writing classrooms in ethical ways that our students are accessing. They're growing up around these. And as like any other technologies, we need to really be critical about the medias and these technologies that we're using in them and how we're using them. And so I definitely think that we need to be having conversations with our colleagues, with our students, and with the schools that we work with, because it's not going to go away anytime. It's not going to go away. It's here. We're learning as we go, and we definitely need to engage with it and learn about it so that we can be critical consumers of it and ensure that we are not replicating oppressive structures or systems as we are engaging in these technologies.
And Lucinda's writing is really on my mind, and I love how she refers to AI and these natural language generators and processors as electric sheep and robot writers.
Yeah.
And so it speaks to this idea, again, that Stephanie, you were also mentioning about this narrowing of what literacy and literacy education means, this autonomous model. So then if AI can do that kind of stuff, and if that's what teachers are worried about, then what becomes the role of the in-person literacy educator? How should we rethink, redefine, reimagine what literacy education looks like and what our jobs as literacy educators are?
I think English teachers to themselves in their classrooms are in unique sort of positions to be able to have these conversations, exactly the conversations that Tracy describes with students. Now, I do think it is a game changer. And when people use the calculator analogy and say it's just a calculator, I think, well, Italy banned, a whole country banned ChatGPT. So I don't think many countries have banned calculators when they brought in. I'm old enough to actually remember when calculators arrived in my maths classroom in primary school. So yeah, I think it is a real game changer. And I've changed my position on it. I do wonder if where people are in the hype cycle of exposure to it affects how you feel about it. Because back when I first encountered these writing tools 2.5 years ago or so, I was cautiously optimistic, and I wrote some articles about how we need to engage with them and all that sort of thing. And as I've learned more and more about them, I feel myself really pulled in those two directions, in that the necessity of engaging with them, because this is the world of, as Tracy says, of our students and of our futures. I don't think there's any putting the horse back in the stable. But I think there probably isn't currently any ethical way to use these tools at all. So we're in this position where we know these things are trained on a stolen corpus of materials that, court cases are playing out at the moment as we speak. We know they're potentially taking people's jobs. Well, they're not taking them, but the humans who are using them are potentially taking, they're capitalists who are using them are taking people's jobs. We've got people actually striking at the moment with the screenwriters and actors strike in the US, and they're striking for all of us because we've already got a trial taking place in Victoria. The Department of Education is doing a trial with avatars, holographic avatars as teachers. So this future is already here. There are the people who are harmed in the creation of these tools through watching violent content and doing data labeling and all of that kind of thing. And when we get students to use them and teachers and pre-service teachers to use them, we're putting them at risk because there are all the issues, the legal issues of copyright and privacy infringement that we're potentially exposing people to. So I really, it's just the whole thing about the tech industry too that brings back to us who made these things, whose voices are privileged, all of those big critical literacy questions, which English and language arts teachers are so fantastic at asking, need to be brought to the classroom, I think probably before we even use them, although maybe there's no before anymore because everyone's so immersed.
So really, I feel like I have so much to say about this. And I would reiterate that I think that our job as literacy educators, our primary job is never to create workers who could just produce standardized kinds of text on the other end of of a screen or the other end of a process at all. So again, I feel like this is the one place where AI is exciting for me, because I feel like it can actually finally really give us the rupture in literacy education that so many of us have been working toward for 20, 30 plus years. So I think a part of this question is also like, what is the purpose of education? Why education? Why should we keep coming together in spaces and gathering children and youth and adults across the lifespan? And I think a lot of folks have tried to disrupt a normative purpose of education for a long time. And that normative purpose of education tends to take hold in our schools through politics and policy. And that purpose of education is a colonial, white supremacist, neoliberal, capitalist agenda for education. So I think that we have lots of models and ideas and philosophies and pedagogies out there about what does it mean to gather people together in a material discursive space. How do we make places together where people come and they do meaningful things and they're in dialogue and they learn about themselves and they learn about each other and they can recognize injustice and they can be creative and they can dream. And really, instead of being like a justice oriented, a future oriented pedagogy of what might happen 5 years down the road, to create spaces every single day with people that are the spaces we want to be living in, and to do it today. So what does that mean? What's the materiality of those spaces? What is what kind of affect are we trying to produce together in these spaces? What are people doing? How are they being? And I think, like I said, we have lots of models. We have maker spaces that have been out there forever. We have art spaces. Actually, I just glanced over at my notes and I saw Donna Haraway. So, and, I think that Donna Haraway would say that part of our role in this world is kin making with humans and kin making beyond humans. And literacy classes, I think, and literacy spaces can be gathering spaces and really living and fulfilling the kind of ethical and just world that we want, and trying to do it today.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that. And I think part of what's resonating with me, and it also kind of gets back to these kind of different levels of freakouts. So on one hand, like as literacy scholars, we shouldn't be freaked out about, this technology in classrooms, because we know that, like, and this is why I invoked what is Foucault's "What is an author" in the NCRLL thread. We know that, like, what constitutes authorship has always been historically variable, and I mean, from storytelling traditions to participatory culture, and we could go on with kind of countless examples of this. And AI, it's kind of this like post-human iteration of, co-authorship or some other form of authorship. And it may, in many, push us to kind of imagine, beyond, the idea of the individual author and all the notions of property that come with that, because I think that concept really arose in many ways, with capitalism. So in some ways, I get really excited about AI. And, another, kind of discussion I was having with my buddy is that we were reflecting back to this huge text we read as undergraduates, Gadamer and Gadamer's notion of like fusion of horizons, you know? And there's almost a similar dynamic that goes on when AI or chat boxes, you're like, you know, person you're in dialogue with, you know, it has this kind of sweeping encyclopedic knowledge that it's kind of grabbed from all over. And then you come in, you know, with your own kind of cultural, historical horizon. And it's so much in the questions, like the logic of questions and answers, like how you phrase things with the chat, you know, and how you kind of condition it to answer your questions. But I was actually thinking about Victoria a lot, who's on this call, and many of the conversations we've had, because like when we were growing up and you would read like the textbook, you know, there were so many aspects of our own identities and histories which were absolutely erased and not in the textbook. But with chat, you know, I can actually kind of condition through this logic of question and answers to talk about, for example, the subaltern history of Mindanao. And it kind of creates possibilities for, I think, students, you know, to, you know, we have to support them in engaging and, you know, in dialogue with chat and really kind of like pursuing their own kind of singular inquiries, right? And exploring for perhaps like, just as one example, kind of the complexities and nuances of identity, you know, which are often erased, you know, in the kind of typical history books. So on that hand, you know, I'm not freaking out. I actually see a lot of possibility. And I think we in the literacy field, you know, should be really prepared and supporting students and educators and thinking about creative ways. But then the other level of freak out, like, you know, and then Grace, this gets back to your question about what role are real teachers. I don't know what role are real teachers. I mean, just like we're seeing with, you know, the actors strike, like, you know, there's such a consumer thing going on where instead of real teachers, you can have avatar teachers, you know, and you can kind of like create these avatars to be like the liberal progressive teacher or the strict teacher or, you know, whatever teacher you want, you know, whatever the consumer wants, you know, and we're not really kind of like necessarily needed anymore. And when my brain goes down that rabbit hole, you know, I get a little freaked out.
One thing that the final comment that Gerald made me think about is that who will have the privilege to have access to real teachers. And this was kind of a soapbox I was on about a decade ago when our university started going to fully online master's programs, and they were really trying to incentivize us to do that. And there was a big debate and about who will eventually then have access to brick and mortar places where and real people and real human beings. And you know, there's a lot there. Obviously, we can have access to real human beings through technology and online education. But I think that thinking about an avatar being a teacher, or, you know, I mean, I already see it here. I walk into a middle school, but everyone is on their one-to-one device with headphones on. So I walk into a classroom of 25 young people, and they might as well be at home. I don't know why they're there. They could be anywhere doing what they're doing. Yeah. So just the thing about like deep, rich, place-based, sociocultural based, context-based, engaging and learning, it feels like that gets, you know, it has, at least there's a risk of that being just pulled away from everyone, unless you have the right kind of support and people are showing you how to use these tools to get that.
Because of that, one of the questions that we're wondering is, how does AI impact the connection then between writing and identity, particularly sociocultural identity? And along those lines, whose sociocultural identities does ChatGPT and AI privilege, especially since we know that it's drawing from the information that's available on the internet. So what sociocultural identities are privileged in the internet sources that AI draws from.
I think with identity, I mean, there are a couple of things that come to mind with AI that are pretty interesting and pretty complicated. On the one hand, there's a lot of documented work already around how AI training data sets have been racist or classist or gendered in certain kinds of ways, and have really, because you always have to think about, how any, like with AI, you're always thinking, well, there's some interest here, there's corporate interest, and there's also a trained data set, right? These two things come to mind. There's some training data set, and that loads it up already with a certain kind of perspective on the world and a certain kind of prejudice, a certain way of seeing things, and excludes and includes. It works power. So that's going on. We know that's going on. But one of the things I think that's really complicated for identity is that AI creates with sort of the capacity to do mass data analytics, and combined with AI, creates data categories that we didn't even have before. So if we're thinking like along if we're thinking along classic sociocultural or sociological demographics, AI creates categories that aren't really even responding to those demographics. It's creating like 250 categories of identity that corporate interests will be interested in, which includes sometimes demographic information, but also include information about people's practices and about preferences, about musical tastes, about interests, and create demographic or actually artificial categories of identity. And so at the level, even extended to the level of the individual, sometimes, they talk about this as a kind of mass individualization, the sense that you're using the technology to either to sell or to convince somebody at the individual level, but you're massifying information around that individual. And I think that just feels so different to me, right, than the ways that we've been thinking about identity and how the technology shapes that.
Gerald, you said something about a real teacher. I think we can all agree that ChatGPT is not going to replace real teachers, right? It's a tool, right? Or you're like, wait a second.
No, I mean, I
doesn't
think AI
agree.
they're talking about this, right now with like, this is some part of what the actors strike is about, right? That, like someone can do like one movie and they can capture, all that person's mannerisms and the way they speak, really accurately. And then they actually won't need the actual human being anymore.
I definitely want to ask Tracy specifically, because as someone who's a director and creator for a writing program for a community where identity is central, how do you see this impacting the work that you're doing with the girls and the mothers and in your community, where identity and sociocultural demographics are really important to what you write and how you represent yourself?
It definitely does not privilege our voices or our stories or our histories. And I think about when I go searching for things or even like images, like you have to search a very certain specific way. And some of the stuff that comes up, I'm like, well, that's not how we represent ourselves. And that's not what I think of when I think of a young Latina adolescent girl, because some stuff that comes up, I'm like, wow, yikes. And so it definitely does not, it privileges and centers one way of knowing and being. And that is exactly what my work works to counter and to dismantle and to bring from the margins to the center the girls' voices and the girls' stories. And it makes me think a lot about even the publishing industry and how this can continue to be another way where only one type of narrative can be told because of how these how things are generated. And so it makes me think that the work is even more critical than ever, and thinking about how to engage with more deeply so that I understand it more. Because I'm going to put it out there, like I'm like learning as I'm going, and I'm trying to access as much new learning for myself so that I can work alongside my girls and my communities to support our understandings of what this means for for our work and for us moving forward together. I don't know if I answered your question.
And yes, in Australia, we've got similar sorts of situations as well, and questions about who's represented on the internet. But we also have the situation of, with Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous communities needing to retain control of those knowledges and not necessarily wanting all of that, their things and cultural information and stuff and language information to be out there on the internet to be used anyway by anyone. And so, you know, while it might be good to have it out there and being incorporated into ChatGPT's voice, so to speak, it might also not be. So there are all these kinds of complexities and contradictions and everything. It's very difficult. So I worry about the voice that ChatGPT speaks with, or seems to speak with. But I also really worry about personalized learning as a tsunami driven by the tech industries that is going to hit us, and it's coming. And I know many people, even at my own university, they're trying to develop cradle to grave learning bots that will accompany you through your life. I'm not sure what they will mean for school and university and everything, but they don't, these personalized learning systems and these AI driven bots, they don't recognize you as a person. They don't see you as a person. They see you as a set of continuously, evolving data points, and, just a set of data. And so I've read some really good critical work looking at the idea that this just surpasses even the idea of subjectivity and the idea of being addressed as a subject. You don't have any opportunity to speak back in this rapidly evolving, continuous summation of you as data. And so I think that has really important implications for how we understand what is a learner and what is learning and everything. And with seeing, I'm not sure if you're seeing it other places as well, but the resurrection of things like learning styles, a neuro myth that has been absolutely debunked, that people have these essentialized ways of learning, that's being resurrected because it's necessary for the categorization that underpins, the so-called personalized learning. But once again, we come back to the idea of criticizing this, or critiquing this language, personalized learning. What does that really mean? And what's that going to mean for students when we have other forms of AI, like, emotion recognition, eye tracking and everything, pinning them to their screens and making sure that they're on task with their personalized learning.
Well, the keyword is accurate. ChatGPT is inaccurate a lot of the time, and it's so confidently presenting inaccurate information. It does. And so this is a question for teacher, like, how do we prepare and guide students to approach text generation tools like ChatGPT in ways that emphasize critical thinking and analysis? Because people are turning in stuff as is, and it's not accurate. So what do we do?
That's such a great question. And Gerald, I want to pivot back to what you just said, because a lot of work has been done in machine learning for many years, to the point that, Khan Academy has introduced AI, bots in their newest version, which really do respond directly to students. If you've ever used any version of Khan Academy for anything, it was kind of basic standard answers, but now it's becoming more, targeted to what it is that you're struggling with. So it's functioning as a tutor. And even though ChatGPT is inaccurate, there are other types of platforms that I can see that, folks I've talked to at AERA from the Netherlands have been using in math, where the first question I said is, well, why do you need a math teacher then if it's learning what the students are having trouble with, and then providing predictable text or providing information to help guide them and understand the problem? And that's what I used ChatGPT for the very first time. I was so stuck on a problem. I knew there was an equation. I couldn't figure it out. I'm not a math person. And so I would type the whole thing in ChatGPT, but I said, show me the steps to solve this problem. and then show me the answer, because I wanted to understand the math behind what I was trying to figure out. And it did. And I was like, oh my gosh. So anyway, it was, and this was December. So I haven't tried to do any, mathematical equations since December. I've been doing other things with it, but I was really blown away by it. Just made me think, like, gosh, what does this mean then for teaching and learning? And most importantly, how do we get ahead of it and start thinking about how we are collaborating? And obviously we want the collaboration to be rooted in accurate information, as you're saying, Victoria. So that's a really important piece. But I think part of it is demystifying what it is and what it does. And Stephanie, that's the experience I had with my students who are also undergrads, most of them juniors, this spring, is just working on prompt engineering. And the thing I was shocked about is how many of them were nervous to say they knew what ChatGPT was. They were nervous, even the fact that I was talking about it in class. And then I said something, what's the energy? What's going on here? Like, why is everyone seeming like you want to say more than what you're saying? And they're like, well, we were told this is cheating. And so there's a lot of shame around integrating technology. And, we're better. I've seen emails from school districts to students about, we're scholars here. We don't do this, we don't do that. And it's really interesting, the discourse that's being sent out to certain schools and certain students about what it means to be a learner and what it means to partner with a tool versus turn over your thinking to the tool. And so I think that critical thinking piece is just lots of experience of, I've used it to do meal planning. I've used it to do I got every day I try to use it to do something so that I could figure out what it is doing well for me in my life around productivity and automation, and what it is really doing not a very good job at because of the inaccuracies. And I think part of it is just being okay with not knowing how that's feeding the system in the way that I don't want to feed it. But I also need to know more as a user and a learner and a thinker so that I can be more informed in how I talk about this with students and with teachers. And so I think that's the first thing, is like, in the next 30 days, figure out something you can do with any type of generative AI. It doesn't have to be ChatGPT, so that you're just informed about what its affordances are and what its capability and functionality is. And then you can start kind of dreaming and planning and thinking about ways to engage students. I could see all kinds of ways to talk with students about what are some of the issues in your community that you're seeing and documenting, that you have, really thought about important solutions that you can kind of leverage technology and media to solve. And then what happens if you put a prompt in and ask ChatGPT to tell you about that same issue in your community? What do you get back? How does that information square up with what you're seeing day to day? And so bringing some criticality to that, I think it's important, but we have to get over the hump of, this is cheating, students shouldn't have it, no one should be touching it, you're a bad human if you do this. And I had a principal say that to me a couple of weeks ago, actually, like, isn't that cheating? Because when I was talking about the way that I was using it, and so I thought, okay, so then your teachers and your students are probably not talking about this at all with you, if this is, your immediate response. So something about our dispositions, still being critical, but our dispositions towards the new, this, whatever this is, as a tool and a collaborative tool for learning, instead of doing the thinking or replacing our ability to engage in just meaningful work. And I think one other thing I would add is that what I'm concerned about is our relationships with students. And that's what I've seen this spring unravel. Instead of how can we talk with students about how to use it, is I'm trying to catch students using it. I'm going to assume they're doing something wrong. All of the policies are punitive based. And if I even suspect it, I'm just going to give them a 0. One of the student teachers told me that her, 8th grade cooperating teacher gave a few students 0s on an assignment because she suspected that they used ChatGPT. And her rationale was, if they didn't use it, they would come argue with her about the grade. And if they did use it, they were just going to be quiet. And so to me, that's when you get into these other identity markers of which students feel privileged or confident or even capable of pushing back on grades that they get from their teachers. So it just raises a lot of other issues around ethics, along with being critical thinkers, that we have to be honest about and transparent about and talk about, so that we can start to support each other around.
The concrete examples you gave, and it just gets back to some, fundamental problems in the school system, which are so carceral and punitive, you know, there's a way in which that something like Chat GPT is just going to exacerbate, you know, an already kind of surveillance, you know, disposition in education.
I think, like many technological advances, very privileged people figure out a way to exploit it so that they can benefit from it. And people who are often marginalized and minoritized are not able to, or allowed to, or permitted to exploit it in a way that is for their benefit. So absolutely, you can already see, at least I can already see how certain groups of people are already exploiting it to make a lot of money. And those people are already people who had access to a lot of money. So it's, you know, I'll go back to my Marxist position again, that it's going to accelerate the massive income and wealth inequalities in our society and across the globe. And it's going to do it in such a devastating way. So that's another, you know, when we think about literacies, is like, how do we think about how resources like money are distributed in our society, and how can we be critical of how money is distributed and redistributed in our society. It just reminded me of, I asked ChatGPT to write an essay on universal basic income. And I did this a long time ago, like back in December or whatever. And it wrote a really decent essay. And then it included one line that said, however, universal basic income could disincentivize people to work. So I responded back to it and said, why did you say that? There's nothing in the research that warrants you making that claim. And then it responded back to me and said, well, what would you say instead? And I told it what I would say instead. So all these biases, and I think biases toward capitalism and toward income inequality, and toward this idea that, you know, some people just deserve less. Some workers just deserve less, period, in our society. And we just, I think that this is going to be yet another tool where people with money are going to exploit it to get lots more money.
And even if they're, you know, even if kind of in the discourse of chat there isn't biases, you know, like capitalism is a totalizing system, you know, and so kind of getting back to Kevin, what you said about this proliferation of identities that can be marketed to, you know, it can absorb even dissent and make it part of the system. Yet at the same time, and Maria Paula, you know, when I told her I was coming here, she just told me about this one article, which I didn't read, which I wish I had read it, but really talked about all the sweatshop labor behind AI, right? As people are like scrubbing for information, it's real sweatshops, right? So the whole infrastructure of it is premised on this really kind of profound inequality, although almost like at the discursive level, it could absorb and market, you know, all sorts of identities, even resistant ones.
I wanted to pick up on some, you started talking about ethics, Deetra, and I sort of wanted to pick up on that too, because sometimes, I mean, there is a distinction between ethical thought and critical thinking, and I think there's a lot of overlap as well. But I think the idea of these kind of ethical conversations, or like what are rights around AI and that kind of thing, I just feel like that's just going to be an exploding area of work. I know that a lot of people are working on that already, and I wanted to put in a plug for one of my former doc students who is now working on a postdoc in AI, but Sarah Burris is doing work on ethics in AI and developing a middle school curriculum for ethics in AI. And one of the things we were talking just a couple of days ago, one of the things she was talking about is, using the White House Bill of Rights. I didn't even know there was one, but there's a White House Bill of AI Rights that's a draft form. And she was using this with middle school kids, and they were sort of talking through that and critiquing it, but also thinking about it relevant to their age group, which I thought was kind of a cool activity. And but the other thing that I wanted to mention with respect to this more general question is around accuracy and inaccurate information. To me, it seems like we're going to lose this game if we go after things that we've been and that we've done in the past. Which is, I remember, at the beginning of like internet studies and new literacies there were these teacher guides of like, how do you trace back where the information is coming from? And remember all the sort of like, oh, look at .com and look at .org and look at .gov. And, remember that kind of stuff, like these structured ways of determining whether information is there bias evident in the language and all that kind of thing. Like we're so far past that. So there's questions around, even the question around what does this mean to have a critical view around accuracy? And as we're sort of more like co-conspirators with technologies and working with technologies, I don't have a good answer for that at all, but I think it's a really ripe question. But one thing that I do think that we need to do more of, though, which is related to this question of critical thinking, is to give our students some idea of how these technologies are operating. I don't mean, computer science degrees, but I mean a clearer idea of how some things are operating. For instance, we have all this conversation in the field around multimodality, but image recognition by AI is a particular kind of thing that is nothing like image recognition without AI. It doesn't function. Images are not read in the way. In fact, we often use discourses like, the AI sees something. Well, it doesn't see something. You're seeing is a different kind of operation altogether. So seeing is much closer to what we think of as like, as a situated literacy. It uses all kinds of background information. It filters things and everything. Image recognition absolutely doesn't use background information. Absolutely just goes according to characteristics of a specific image and is trying to develop a decontextualized literacy that can be applied anywhere. And so that image is always that image all the time. And so just as using it as an example, just trying to think like, what is the logic being operated here? Because part of what gets in our way, I think sometimes, is even the discourse around these things. We see the technology as writing, we see it as composing, we see it as involved in a conversation, we see it as seeing things or having intelligence. And all that discourse is, it's the best we've got maybe, but it's kind of a trap for mistaking the work that's happening for particular human qualities. We need some distinction, I think, in terms of what is particularly human and what the machine is doing in its manner of operation. I think that'll help us with the critical thinking piece.
I think that it is really important for students to understand as much as possible what these things are and how they work. And that is the essence of, beginning a critical engagement with them. Because fundamentally, you need to understand that they are giant probability machines and giant cliche machines, that they're not working by reason, or human kind of logic in terms of what word comes after what word. They're just statistical sort of, and I think students are interested to understand more about them. But I also think that we need to think in transdisciplinary kind of ways and bring history into the conversation as well, and look back with students too at the history of chatbots as interlocutors and communicators, and go right back to Eliza, the first chatbot, and look at the whole idea of the Eliza effect and how humans are so readily taken in by these bots and want to believe in them. It's a kind of wanting to believe in the man, I'm saying man deliberately here, man's ability to, create, to be God and to create people and to create entities. So that's a really fascinating history. And I know others have talked about the importance of understanding code, trying to the extent that we can, understanding algorithmic thinking and what the lacks and the absences and what humans can bring to the whole equation.
I definitely think that we cannot lose sight of the human factor in all of this. And in thinking about our writing classrooms and how we work to develop our writers, and thinking about their critical literacies, and also thinking about how they engage with sources and ensuring that they're the ones operating these technologies, and so they they have the power to ensure that they don't mishandle them, but also that they are not just continuing to falsify information. And so it goes really deep into that, the close reading, the where we get our sources, and how we're engaging in these technologies. So continuing to deepen the things that we've already been doing. And as teachers, learning as we go. And Lucinda, you brought up that good point, like this was all happening and teachers are starting their classrooms, and that we need to work alongside teachers as to support them and learn alongside them and learn with them in all of these ways. And I just think of all the work that our teachers are doing all the time, and there's always something new. And this is definitely something that we all need to learn about together.
Yeah, and our English teachers are experts at analysing language. So we can bring those fantastic skills into thinking critically about all of the rhetoric around these things, which I think is so important. And Tracy, you're mentioning and emphasising the human there too. It reminds me, I just want to put it out there in terms of criticising language or critiquing language, this whole idea of human in the loop. The idea that in the future, everything will be all right because we'll still have humans in the loop. It's a human in the loop technology, whatever. We need to really stand up and say, hang on a moment, human in the loop with writing is a massive demotion of where humans sit in that process. And that shouldn't actually be reassuring that humans might just be reduced to fact checkers or, so anything like that in relation to writing.
Because we also think about our feelings and our experiences, which we can't get away from in that writing process, and the messages that we want to create to change the world and change, and to speak our truths. And so I absolutely agree with that. Like there's not feelings, there's not emotions, there's not the historical passing on of storytelling that our communities are engaged with in really important ways. And absolutely, I 100% agree with that.
It makes sense. I guess we as a generation it's not new for us to think about fake news and how to teach our students how to dodge fake news and misinformation in this age. And so I guess that would just add on to what Tracy was saying, that teachers are already doing that. And so the critical literacies as pieces of that as well.
Okay, I love all the talk about the human part of it and how critical, how central humans are to writing. They're just not part of this loop. Lucinda, as you were saying, I imagine them being absolutely at the center of all of this.
How are we going to teach the value of writing as a skill if we can effectively just assign that task to a third party? Like, to what extent are we going to have to fight for the right to write and the right to teach writing?
We used to be able to say to kids, you're going to need to write in the future. You're going to need to write in the workplace, whatever kind of job you have. You might want to have a website for your glazing business or your this or that, and you'll need to write things about yourself and put yourself forward. And yes, it's a big sigh, because now we're not going to be able to say that, because I already know from hearing from companies who've got early access to Microsoft Copilot in the Office suite that they're not really doing writing anymore. They just say to their phone to go through all the, annual reports from the last 12 years and pull out these particular bits and relate them to what was said in the meeting next week and send it around to as a memo to everyone. That's the writing of the future. So I don't know. We know that writing and cognition are intimately linked. So we know that if we want to teach people to think. Writing is an important way that we can go about that, or composing, because we've got to remember not everyone writes. People with different abilities, you know, use assistive technology and everything, but composing in some way, shape or form is really, really important. So I think we are going to have to try and make this case any way that we can, that the teaching of writing is still really important, and we do need to look at what's happening in industries, especially the creative industries, and how journalists and playwrights and copywriters and screenwriters and authors and editors and all of these people are using generative AI, and the limitations that they're finding with it as well, but making sure that we can you know, use those voices from industry to say, well, you know, we use it like this, but it lacked this, and so therefore we need to do that, and that will help us know what's important to inculcate in our students. And I think we're already hearing that it's the softer skills that map really well onto English, things like compassion, empathy, ability to empathize with audiences, and those kinds of things, really imagine and speak to audiences, that are going to be much more essential in the writing of the future. And I know someone else has used in this conversation the word meaningful, and that's something that I just keep coming back to. Maybe this can make writing more meaningful than some of the kinds of writing that we've done in school in recent years, certainly in Australia anyway, driven by high stakes testing.
I really appreciate what you said about the importance of composing and meaningful opportunities for authentic writing. We've talked a lot about authentic writing, authentic purposes, and authentic audiences. And I really think, like you mentioned, we need to think about all the ways that we write. And one thing that writing is thinking, and you know, we process our thinking through writing, and we learn through writing, and we process life through writing. And it makes me also think about restorative ways of writing, and how writing can be therapeutic. Writing is a way to like get it out and get it on paper. And in thinking about how are we going to you know, tell our students, you know, that they have to write, and really thinking about what are all the ways that we've written historically today, and what can writing be for you, and engaging with those conversations, and thinking about how communities have used writing, you know, to heal, to thrive, and to uplift, you know, voices that have been at the margins. And I really appreciate about the composing and the authentic, and the feelings that come out when you write from your own voice and from your own experiences and from your own heart, from the stories of your community, from your traditions and your cultures and all of that is very contextual and historical. And I just wanted to make sure I added that to the conversation as well, because that's what I believe about writing. And that is why I'm like, get out your notebooks, we're writing, like put your phones away, we're writing, let's write it down. And I just think that there's something, the pen to paper, like that we need to maybe push even more, so that we continue to have that process, and not in a punitive way, in a way that our writers can think about different ways that they're writing and for different purposes, and have that be one of the ways that we're composing in our classrooms, so that we don't lose the writer in all of this.
And Tracy, I think that you have tapped in there to something that people everywhere are really wondering about and thinking about, the role of writing. So recently I did a conversation article with a colleague, Maria Nicholas. I actually wanted to write something about sort of chat GPT and writing and the standardizing of writing, and the editor said, no, we want something on handwriting. What will the role of handwriting be in the future? And I thought, oh, okay, we'll do that, because Maria is a primary teacher and I'm a secondary teacher, English teacher. So we wrote the article, and oh my goodness, it just went viral. It went everywhere, and we were interviewed on the radio all around the country. It's just been translated into French and published in The Conversation France, and it was really exploring exactly those things that you've just described about writing, and the ways it can be, as you say, therapeutic. And there are all sorts of other reasons for writing rather than just crude kind of proof of knowledge or acquisition of skills or those sorts of things.
I love, Tracy, that what you said was, how can we make sure we don't lose the writer? I love that so much, because it's the writer, and maybe not just the product and the process, but the person.
I love this so much as well. A lot of my own work is about the embodiment of literacies and what it means for the actual human body, the human being that's involved in all of this. And this, harkens back to some things that we actually talked about before recording this, about, the creative industries. I know Gerald was talking a lot about, he was talking about the actor strike, but there's also the writer's strike that had started before then. The New Yorker had a partially GPT authored article, and The Guardian had an article that was completely written by AI. But that raises the question, is writing then just about, the facts and what else does the writer bring to it? And so obviously that's, I think, one of the reasons why the creative industries are protesting this. One of the questions that I have that all of this brings to mind is, how then can AI be used to continue the powerful work of writing as a means for social change and social justice? Because I think that's what humans bring to just the act, the process, the experience of writing as well.
Well, but I think if we can develop more ethical large language models that aren't harming people in the process of their creation and their moderation and everything, I think that's a big question. If we decide there are ethical ways to use these in the classroom, then there are things people are already doing that are really exciting. For example, with translanguaging, bringing students' first languages into the English classroom and making much more seamless dialogue between teacher and student and student and student. So some really lovely work being done there. So I don't want to be deterministic and assume that these technologies are bad. And I think there are also ways that they can support writers. Like I just want to bring up brainstorming here, because back in my electric sheep days, I was saying, oh, students can use these things for brainstorming, but it's increasingly coming out, and this, because it takes so long to get academic articles published, there's not enough evidence out there, but anecdotal evidence is saying that using generative AI in the early stages of writing actually shuts down thought and criticality. So perhaps in the future, we'll have different protocols for using these things that will be not human in the loop, human first, that we want students to think themselves first and then turn to AI tools, so to speak, if you want to call them tools, or data extraction services, as I like to call them, turn to the tools to see, well, what have I missed, or what other ideas or what challenges could there be to what I've already thought? So I think that's important. But also, just a flag too, that early anecdotal evidence is showing that using these writing tools advantages strong students and doesn't do much for other students. So potentially is really expanding an achievement gap in the classroom that we already know is based on probably, particular kinds of cultural capital and financial capital that students have in their backgrounds. So it's a really vexed question about what good can they do, how can they be used, and then at the same time, what are they potentially doing that's not so good?
It makes me think again about access and beginning K-12 schooling, and who has access to this. The professional development teachers are getting, the time the teachers are getting to learn about these technologies, to try them, to explore them. And then the access students have. I know lots of schools that I worked at, we had a computer lab, but it was just for interventions. The students would get on there, and it wasn't like we were going and doing web work. There were certain times we were able to do that, but it was really in there for like reading interventions or math interventions. And it was very limited. And so like some of that critical media literacy work that we wanted to do, like, because I have everyone have a computer, like it was hard to do it like one-on-one And so I really think about access and then what that means for college admissions and some of that stuff. And so we've seen our communities use technologies in really powerful ways to advocate, to raise consciousness for movements. And I just wonder about that access element and who's going to have access to it and who doesn't, and how that makes the stories that are told continuing to be by certain communities. So that's something that I thought about when you were saying, I think about access a lot.
And to what extent does talk about all the exciting things these tools can potentially do just distract from the talk about access? That is, I think you're on the most important thing, Tracy. It's the most important thing. None of it can happen without access and without funding, without access depends on money, actual money coming to communities that need it.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with teachers needing time. I think that time is missing from so many conversations about these things in the media and from policymakers and everything. It's almost as if, to me, the enormity of it is such that all teachers just need to be made half-time teaching and the other half of time, their time coming up to speed with all of what's happening and being able to put themselves in and work collegially to become in a position where they can teach with and about these tools.
Love that. Thank you. That really segues really well to access. What implications do you see for diverse writers and learners, for example, multilingual, neurodiverse, etc.? How can we be ethically and fairly prepared for it as practitioners in the classroom? Or what other questions do we need to be asking?
The people who are creating these technologies, we need to have a diverse representation. And maybe I'm learning as I'm going, but like, I just think about like, sometimes when I tell Siri to call someone, like she doesn't know who I'm talking about because the name is not like, the name's like a Spanish name and she doesn't understand it. So I have to say it like, Anglicize it so that she can like call who I want her to call. So it's things like that that I think about, like if we're gonna think about our multilingual learners, our global community, having access to these technologies. And so I just really think about the people creating these and their experiences that they bring to it too.
Yes, because we know it's an incredibly, my
daughter was like, Siri, like it's not hard. Like this is who we're asking for. Sorry.
We know it's an incredibly narrow group of people who are not only making these things, but who are profiting from them. And I think we've got to keep in mind that the whole emperor's new clothes nature of it. I went to a seminar on Friday last week where we had virtual reality role playing with a bot in a virtual reality environment. So an AI driven bot in a virtual reality environment, presented to us completely unproblematic as inclusive teaching practice. But if you go back and think about all the access issues, all the hardware and all the software and all the subscriptions and all the whatevers that you need to, and the things that you need to drive that VR experience, and the people whose bodies can cope with virtual reality as it is at the moment, it's not inclusive at all. And yet you can have this rhetoric of, oh, well, people in remote areas who can't get to this or that will be able to experience things in these immersive worlds. Well, those are the people that just don't have the digital access at all anyway, and are least likely to have a set of VR headsets just hanging about in a storeroom down the hall when they don't have enough keyboards for kids. So yeah, I think there's just so much tech boosterism and vast rhetoric about the benefits of these things that we really need to challenge every time we can, every opportunity we can, and resist being sucked into them and sucked into the way that they always present better productivity, better efficiency, all of those things, and even can co-opt the language of inclusion for their own ends. In terms of proficiency and everything, I fear an absolute tsunami, another tsunami, I'm talking tsunamis today, of just outputs that we're all expected to do. And because we can write something in 1 second now at the push of a button, we're expected to write things in 1 second now. And therefore, there's just all this guff just being produced by bots, being then read by bots. And I read a great metaphor the other day that these things are going to be then sucking on each other's exhausts, because then the language models are going to be trained on what's just being produced by language models. And is that the future of public sort of thought, shared thought? I find that really a bit depressing, but I don't want to end on a depressing note. So
we cannot forget the writer. We cannot lose our writers.
This discussion about criticality, about just the humanizing aspects of literacies and teaching. It's really it's reminding me of all of the things that Stephanie taught me when I was her doctoral student, but also just it's giving me hope for what we can possibly do with this game changer that's been thrust upon us. And as I was listening to all of you, the thunder, I didn't expect a thunderstorm, but the thunder has been building here in the background, and I'm choosing to ignore that as some sort of ominous sign. And it makes me think about the fact that we've all heard everybody's freaking out about AI in terms of ethics or legality. But Dietra, you really started to talk about ways that AI can be used in purposeful, meaningful, equitable ways. Kevin, you were talking about the fact that we live in a post-human world. We are always in these entanglements with non-human things in our learning, in our living. And so I guess a question, I'm looking at the time and I'm so sad that we're going to have to wrap this up. So I'm hoping that this might be a good question to bring everything to some sort of stopping point. I don't want to say some sort of resolution, because this dialogue is going to be ongoing and evolving. How can we use our knowledge of how artificial intelligence has been used and currently exists in our world, and how we interact with it, to better predict and plan for what we might do with it, rather than speculate and fear how it might change us? How can we use it to understand more about what it means to be human, what it means to be in relationships with one another, and how to work to make the world more equitable and socially just for diverse learners and writers?
I guess the only thing I would add to all of the conversations we've been saying, when I think about doing work with children or youth, I'm usually with elementary, but I'm moving more now towards middle, is how can we be more subversive, intentionally subversive with them around technologies that are going to shape their lives. It's already, I don't know how many of you have now had the Google Workplace with AI integrated into your Google, or been asked if you want to be a part of that. But it's showing up now in everything. It won't shock me if it'll be a part of college applications, because students are going to be using it anyway. And so I'm really curious about the ways that we have to think about, especially when we think about equity, making sure that everyone has access to understand how this tool operates and how it works, what could be possible as we know it today, knowing tomorrow it can change, and it will change. And then the ways that it's being used beyond education, in finance, in healthcare, in government, in defense. I mean, it's everywhere. It's all encompassing. It's, banking, everything is going to be tied to these systems, whether we want to talk about it in education or not. And so who are the students who are going to miss out on the conversation and knowing how they're being tracked and surveilled with these types of technologies because we don't give them access to understand how they work. So I think being clear and intentional and subversive with students so that they have the information now to stay on top of what they want to do to, as Stephanie said, live in the world that they envision now instead of waiting till they're 18 or 25. What are we doing now to make sure that they have the information that they need to engage the system in ways that make sense for them?
Deidre, just kind of building off what you're saying, we do. I'm glad you're taking it outside the realm of education also, because I think about Ezekiel Dixon Roman's work on like the way predictive policing in AI, right? And these like racist algorithms, and we have to really kind of prepare our students to kind of, encounter these worlds. And some of it, to be frank with you, like for me, it's breaking down a lot of disciplinary boundaries because like like coding is the underlying grammar for a lot of this. And I don't know anything about coding, as a literacy scholar. And so I'm hoping like future generations will be able to kind of like, break down these barriers and be more subversive, and be kind of like cyberpunks to really challenge the system. Because I feel like in, the most apocalyptic scenarios, the master's tools will take down the master's house, but it'll take down the rest of us also, and so we really need to, I don't know, figure out how to get a handle, on AI so it can definitely be used, in the service of human emancipation.
I'm thinking about all the ways that it's already being used for loans, high interest loans for certain people, very low interest loans for other people, housing applications, rent applications, all, that use of it, that use of it for benefiting capitalists is just incredibly dangerous, and it will just continue to reproduce and exacerbate all of the inequalities that we already see. So I'll take a leap here and say, it's a little seductive to say like capitalism is a totalizing force in our life, or AI also will be, and I'll draw on the work of Gibson Graham, who are feminist geographers, and they have written a lot about what life is like on the margins of capitalism or outside of capitalism. And they have a fabulous book. Gosh, it's getting dated already now. How to Take Your Community Back, or something along those lines. I can't remember. We'll have to get the title, but I love everything that they've written for decades. And one thing that it might sound really unpopular or kind of impossible, but there are lots of people who live outside of these technological worlds. And Donna Haraway, again, would say that this obsession with technology is only really affects a small number of people in the world. And the majority of humans never take off on these technological advances. They only have to live in the ruins of them. We've seen the ruins of the digital acceleration over the decades. We know that there are digital dumping grounds in the most poor and vulnerable areas in the world. And we know who pays the consequences for these very quickly accelerating and accelerating life cycles of technology. And they are the most powerless in a neoliberal capitalist world people. And there are lots of people who are living outside of these technologies. So when I think about conversations that I have with my 18-year-old students and my adult child is that you need to be paying attention to who you're sharing your information with. All the privacy settings, you have to be so mindful that of these systems and the apps and the way that you're connected and synced and all of these things, and really skeptical of it. And there really are people who still deal in cash, not crypto and not Venmo. And I actually think, a lot of that might come back fairly strong in a lot of places. The Guardian newspaper has said that they've found fake Guardian articles that it's hard for them to even discriminate. Like, they can't even tell that it's not a Guardian article, but it's not a Guardian article. Anything we see on the screen, like, there will not be a way for even the smartest, savviest people to figure out what's accurate, quote, or not, or what is authentic or not. I think face to face, how are we going to trust that when I pull up the website for my bank, that it's actually my bank? We won't be able to do that. So I think that, there will be a lot more value placed in person to person, face to face. I want to hear you say it. I don't want to see an avatar on a screen. I don't want to read it online. Like, how do you, when you're working with someone, how do you actually know that it's a human? And maybe that's another question we can have for education too. What does it mean to be human, and what is the role of educators in being human? Yeah.
I really like where you're going with that, Stephanie, and it kind of clicks back to something you said early in the conversation around, like, we know quite a lot from certain kinds of pedagogies. I can't remember exactly the list you gave, but one of them was something like play-based pedagogies and face-to-face. And because the question, as it's phrased here, and this isn't a critique of the question, just trying to like think about it in its context, was how might we better predict and plan for what we might do with it? And part of what I'm feeling is how can we also plan for what we might do without it? And how can we, maybe there's a whole series of something like lifeboat pedagogies that we need to keep focusing on to say, that I think this is always a complicated thing with technology, right? Which stance do we take? And we tend to think these things along binary terms, like either you're inside the technical enterprise or outside of it. And so part of the development that we might need, though, is the creation of pedagogies that really put strong purchase on what you're saying, Stephanie, the human, and and really thinking about what does embodied face-to-face communication look like. And one of the reasons we might need that, or creation look like, and one of the reasons we might need that is that it might be one of the things that allows us to return to, with a kind of critical and ethical stance, to the assemblage and sort of find our way, because it might be, in a sense, a kind of honing device to help us remember what actual affect looks like, or love looks like, or connection looks like, rather than being steeped in the midst of the complexity of all of it.
Yeah, chiming in, Stephanie, so much of like what you're saying is a lot of your work, it absolutely appeals to me. I mean, so much of my own work has been about trying to create like alternative social formations within and against even something like the university, which has become like a corporate structure, much less broader capitalism, and I think, and I'll go back to kind of like ancestral ways of being and knowledge, and even my grandfather, when I head that direction. But on the other hand, kind of like climate change, AI is going to find us, and there's going to be in order to combat it, it's going to be a certain level of coordination, across borders, across social boundaries, across political borders, in order to, I don't know, really prevent the end times, because in many ways the end times has already arrived at so many communities, and so that's, you're kind of pointing out a tension I live with, both my almost like ancestral or anarchic desire to, foster these alternative communities and social formations, but on the other hand, the kind of responsibility to be somehow engaged, through kind of collective work and collective social movements towards some, broader, more just vision. And I think it's a tension probably many of us live with, I don't know, I don't want to speak for everyone, but at least I do. So I appreciate that framing a lot.
The first principle needs to be do no harm, and that people need to slow down and think about that, and slow down and learn about these things. So when I give presentations on generative AI, and I'm working with a doctoral student who's doing a lot of presentations and teaching professional learning, we both ask in the room, who has read OpenAI's considerations for educators in relation to the use of ChatGPT? And very rarely does anyone in a room of hundreds of people put up their hand. So those considerations for the use of ChatGPT for educators say it must not be used for assessment. It must not be used for assessment. It's not intended for that. A human needs to assess a student's work. Students are writing for humans. We have to respect fundamental human dignity and the rhetorical purposes of our students, and we have to not harm them with the practices that we're doing. Just because generative AI can do something, that doesn't necessarily mean that it should do something. So I think really moving forward, we've got to take a big breath and we've got to think about the harms. We already know about the extensive harms from people using AI detection software and misunderstanding that detection software is in its infancy, it's just being developed, and it is never proof. It is, and the companies like Turnitin say they do not provide proof of cheating. So to accuse a student of cheating based on cheating in a piece of writing based on, an AI detection score or something is extremely potentially harmful and damaging to relationships with students and everything. So I think everyone needs to slow down, realize that rushing ahead with these things without even doing basic things like reading terms and conditions and considerations and having good policy structures in place to support us, because we can't do all this on our own. Teachers can't do it on their own. They need really wise support. So don't rush into anything. And remember that principle of do no harm and respect for everyone.
As we're coming together in a couple of weeks, is we're thinking again about what is composing, what is writing, what are our goals as teachers of young writers, and really thinking about engaging in those conversations continuously and thinking about the types of writing communities we strive to create in our classrooms, our goals for our writers, and that includes us understanding learning about all the technologies and the advancements that are out there, and thinking about writing as not this static process, but it's constantly evolving, and people are writing in different ways and for different purposes, and engaging in those conversations, thinking about what our values are as educators, as teachers of young writers, as teachers of writers, as writers ourselves, and also learning about these things together. So making sure that we slow down for sure, that we do no harm, and that we are constantly coming back to who we are as educators and ensuring that we are learning alongside our students and also trying things out, but in a way that is not going to cause harm, and in a way that we are constantly kind of, I don't want to say vetting, but like taking small steps, because we're still learning. And I know I'm still learning. I'm not ready to like go all in. I want to explore alongside my students, but not make it a scary thing either, because it doesn't have to be that way, because that's where the freak out comes from. We're really going back to who we are as educators, our goals, and what our beliefs are about, you know, language and literacy learning, and kind of continuing to be in community around these conversations and these ideas.
As we're coming towards the end of the time, I do want to say before we head out a quick conclusion, thank you for your time in considering these questions as literacy educators. We especially would like to thank Stephanie's article that really kickstarted this conversation today. And I know that there are no complete answers, but from this, I learned that from what Deetra said earlier about the urgency to be, quote, clear, intentional, and subversive with AI so that, as Gerald said, quote, AI can be used in the service of human emancipation. So thank you for today. This NCRLL webinar, like Grace said, will be transcribed and published in a forthcoming journal of English teaching, practice, and critique. And if you'd like to revisit anything from that dialogue, that's where you can look to. Please reach out if you have any other questions or comments. And thanks again for your contributions, everyone.